She thought she was hunting the human, only to find him sitting at a campfire making dinner for her. The forest floor of Viridia was a tapestry of decay and life, a damp, loamy cushion that swallowed sound. For 3 rotations, it had been Threxia's hunting ground, and she moved through it not as a visitor, but as an apex predator returning to her domain. Every snapped twig under her armored boot was a controlled, calculated failure, a misstep she allowed herself only when she was miles from her quarry. Now, there were no missteps. Her magenta hair, a vibrant slash of color against the endless green and brown, was tied back severely, though loose strands still clung to the damp air around her face. The 2 pointed, furred ears that rose from her scalp swiveled independently, one canted forward to catch the whisper of wind through the canopy, the other angled back, listening to the memory of her own passage. Her mission was simple, but the target was not. Capture the human. Subject designation, Nikhil, lone survivor of a transport crash decades ago. The High Command's briefing had been clinical. The human species was a biological anomaly, stubbornly, inexplicably resilient. They thrived in environments that should have killed them, adapted to gravities and atmospheres with brutish biological efficiency. Threxia's people, the Xylari, were facing a slow, sterile extinction, their own world's ecosystem failing, their bodies unable to cope with the subtle poisons of their dying home. The human was not just a target, he was a potential cure, a living codex of survival that her science casts were desperate to unlock. They expected a feral creature, a 2-legged animal shaped by isolation and hardship. Threxia had prepared accordingly. Her senses, honed by 1,000 hunts on a dozen worlds, were stretched taut. She tasted copper in the air, the scent of a mineral deposit nearby. She felt the subtle shift in air pressure that spoke of a coming change in weather. And for the last hour she had smelled something else. Wood smoke. Faint, intermittent, but undeniable. Her quarry was careless, or confident. Neither sat well with her. A feral creature would not risk a fire that could be seen for miles. She unslung the pulse rifle from her back, its cold, metallic weight a familiar comfort in her hands. Her movements became even more fluid, her armored form sinking into the shadows of Viridian behemoth trees. She was a ghost in dark plate, the only color the shocking magenta of her hair and the piercing coal-rimmed intensity of her eyes. She found the trail markers soon after, a broken branch, a scuff on a rock that was too uniform for any local fauna. They were deliberate, almost tauntingly obvious. It was a trap. The thought solidified in her mind, cold and sharp. The human was trying to lure her in. Her lip curled, revealing the tips of sharpened canines. Let him try. Her training was superior, her technology unmatched. She was the hunter, he was the meat. That was the fundamental law of the galaxy. She bypassed the obvious path, circling wide through a thicket of thorned vines that snagged at her armor. The scratches were faint, whining sounds in the near silence. She ignored them, her focus entirely on the source of the smoke, now growing stronger, laced with the unfamiliar but distinctly savory scent of roasting food. She crept to the edge of a rocky escarpment, sinking to one knee and peering through the fronds of a massive fern. The sight below stole the breath from her lungs and locked every one of her predatory instincts into a state of stunned, silent confusion. He was there, not hiding, not setting a snare, not sharpening a crude spear. Nikhil, the human, was sitting by a crackling campfire, his back against a large boulder. He was exactly as the grainy satellite images had shown, and yet nothing like them. The raw physical power of him was the first thing that struck her. His chest and arms, left bare by a simple leather harness, were thick with corded muscle that shifted with a fluid ease as he stirred something in a black pot suspended over the flames. A dark, rugged beard framed a strong jaw, and his hair was thick and unruly. He was the picture of a savage, a wilderness dweller, a brute. Yet his posture was one of utter relaxation. He was not on guard. He seemed entirely at home, a man in his own hall, not a hunted animal in a hostile forest. It was a tactical impossibility. No creature with a sense of self-preservation would be so exposed. Threxia's mind raced, cycling through threat assessments and combat scenarios. He had no visible energy weapon. His only tool was the knife sheathed at his hip. He was vulnerable. A single, well-placed shot from her pulse rifle would incapacitate him instantly. Her mission parameters stated capture was preferred, but termination was acceptable if the subject proved too hostile. But there was no hostility here. There was only the gentle crackle of the fire, the slow bubble of the stew in the pot, and the impossibly calm presence of the man. She watched, her finger resting on the trigger, as he lifted a wooden spoon to his lips, tasted, and then added a pinch of something from a small leather pouch. It was an act of such profound, casual domesticity that it felt more alien to her than any monstrous beast she had ever hunted. He looked up, his eyes, warm and deep-set, lifted from the fire and met hers through the 20 meters of dense foliage that separated them. There was no flicker of surprise, no tensing of his muscles. It was the calm, patient look of a man who had been waiting. Her blood ran cold. He had known she was there, not just in the vicinity, but there in that specific spot. He had known all along. All her stealth, all her skill had been worthless. "You can come down now," he said. His voice was a low rumble, carrying easily in the still air. It was not a challenge nor a command, it was an invitation. "The food's almost ready. I imagine you're hungry." Threxia remained frozen, a statue of magenta and black steel. Her tactical mind was a whirlwind of contradictions. This was a trap. It had to be. But her senses screamed otherwise. There were no hidden power signatures, no concealed allies, no subtle tremors of an impending ambush. There was only the man, the fire, and the offer. Her entire life, her entire culture, was built upon a foundation of logical, predatory dominance. You identify the threat, you stalk the threat, you neutralize the threat. You do not accept its dinner invitations. Slowly, deliberately, she rose from her crouch, the pulse rifle held steady, its muzzle pointed directly at his chest. She stepped from the shadows of the ferns, her armored boots crunching on the loose gravel of the ridge. His eyes never left hers, and in their depths she saw not fear, but a flicker of something she could not name. It looked dangerously like amusement. Walking down the incline into his camp was the longest journey of Threxia's life. Each step was a risk assessment, her ears swiveling to map the acoustics of the small clearing, her eyes scanning for the slightest anomaly. The human, Nikhil, simply watched her approach, his large hands resting on his knees. He made no move for the knife at his belt. His sheer physical presence was even more intimidating up close. She was tall for a Xylari, but he matched her height even sitting, his shoulders a solid wall of muscle. The heat from the fire washed over her, a welcome sensation against the cool metal of her armor. She stopped 5 meters from him, a distance that gave her ample time to react, planting her feet in a stable combat stance. "Smells good," he observed, his gaze dropping back to the pot. "A local root vegetable, a little bland on its own, but it absorbs other flavors well. I found a patch of wild herbs a click east of here." He was making small talk. The absurdity of it was a physical blow. She, an elite operative armed with advanced weaponry, stood poised to capture or kill him, and he was discussing recipes. "Why aren't you running?" she asked, her voice a low growl. "From what?" he countered, looking up at her again. "A guest for dinner?" "I am not your guest," she snarled. "I am your hunter." A slow smile touched his lips, crinkling the corners of his eyes. It was a disarmingly warm expression that did terrible things to her professional composure. "You've been a shadow on my heels for 3 days, Xylari," he said, his tone still mild. "If you wanted me dead or in chains, you've had plenty of opportunity. You're cautious. You're methodical. You're also standing in my camp instead of shooting me from the ridge. That tells me you're curious. Curiosity should be fed." He used a thick piece of hide to lift the pot from the fire, setting it on a flat stone. From a pack resting against the boulder, he produced 2 wooden bowls and spoons, setting one down on the ground midway between them. He filled it with the thick, steaming stew before filling his own. The aroma was rich and earthy, making her stomach clench with a hunger she hadn't realized was so sharp. He gestured to the offered bowl with his spoon. It was a test. A gesture of trust she could accept or refuse. Refusal meant a return to hostility. Acceptance was a step into the unknown, a violation of her mission's every protocol. Her pride warred with the undeniable logic of his words. She was curious. This human defied every data point her people had on his species. Understanding him was as critical as capturing him. With a soft curse in her native tongue, she lowered her rifle, slinging it over her shoulder, but keeping one hand near the grip. She moved stiffly, sinking into a cross-legged position opposite him, the bowl between them. The distance was still tactical, but the act of sitting felt like a monumental concession. She picked up the bowl, its wooden warmth a stark contrast to her cold gauntlets. She took a tentative spoonful. The flavor exploded on her tongue, savory, with a peppery heat and a complex herbal note. It was delicious. Against her will, her shoulders lost a fraction of their tension. "So," Nikhil said after a moment of watching her eat, "what does the Xylari High Command want with a long-dead colonist's descendant?" Her head snapped up, eyes wide. The spoon paused halfway to her mouth. He knew who she was. He knew who she worked for. Her mission, her entire purpose here, was not a secret to him at all. The ground, which had seemed so solid a moment ago, suddenly felt like it was crumbling away beneath her. The silence that followed his question was heavier than the humid Viridian air. Threxia placed her bowl down with a deliberate, steady hand, her mind racing to reevaluate every assumption she had ever made. He hadn't just been waiting for her. He had been expecting a Xylari. This was no chance encounter. It was an interception. "How?" she finally managed, her voice tight. "You think you're the only ones with long-range sensors?" Nikhil replied, his tone patient, like a teacher explaining a simple concept. "Your ship has been in orbit for a standard week. A military vessel, trying very hard to look like a civilian freighter. Not very convincing. We knew you'd send a scout to the surface sooner or later." The word "we" hung in the air between them. We, not I, the lone survivor, the feral human. It was all a lie. "Your intelligence is flawed," she stated, recovering her composure. She would not show weakness. She would not show shock. The human colony ship Odyssey was destroyed upon entry. There were no survivors. "The Odyssey was a fiction," he said calmly, finishing his stew and setting the bowl aside. "A name for the public record. Our ship was called the Hearth. And she wasn't destroyed. She was landed." He stood up in one fluid motion, a large, imposing silhouette against the darkening sky. Threxia's hand immediately went to her rifle, her body tensing. He ignored the gesture, turning his back on her, an act of either supreme confidence or utter foolishness. He walked to the sheer rock face behind the camp, a wall of gray stone and green moss she had dismissed as unremarkable. He placed his palm flat against a section that was indistinguishable from the rest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low hum that vibrated through the soles of her boots, a faint seam of light appeared in the rock. The seam expanded, splitting the stone as two massive, perfectly cut doors ground silently inward, revealing a cavern of impossible size beyond, bathed in a soft, artificial light. "The test is over, Threxia," Nikhil said, turning to face her. The light from within the mountain cast his rugged features in sharp relief. "Your people are dying. You came here looking for a biological prize, something to dissect. You thought our strength was in our genes, in our flesh." He gestured into the vast space behind him. "You were wrong. Our strength is in our ingenuity. It's in our ability to take a broken thing and make it a home." She stood slowly, her pulse rifle feeling like a useless toy. Her gaze was fixed on the sight before her. It wasn't a cave, it was an engine room. Massive, ancient machinery, interwoven with glowing hydroponic farms and living quarters carved into the rock, stretched back as far as she could see. It was the repurposed, integrated heart of a colony ship, a society hidden from the galaxy for 300 years. Her mission, her entire understanding of the last few days, was a carefully constructed fiction he had allowed her to believe. She hadn't been hunting a man. She had been on a meticulously planned job interview, and she hadn't even known it. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been inverted, with a force that left her reeling. Threxia followed Nikhil past the colossal stone doors, her armored boots echoing on the polished metal floor of the entryway. The air inside was cooler, cleaner, with the scent of recycled air, growing things, and hot metal. The scale of the place was staggering. Walkways crisscrossed a central chasm that plunged into darkness, while entire sections of the original ship's hull had been welded and fused into the natural rock of the mountain. It was a fusion of high technology and raw geology, a testament to generations of relentless, patient engineering. People, dozens of them, moved on the levels below and above, dressed in the same kind of functional, durable clothing as Nikhil. They paused to look up at her, their expressions not of fear but of sober curiosity. They had been expecting her. "The hearth has been our world for 10 generations, Nikhil explained, his voice low as he led her along a suspended walkway. "When our ancestors crashed, the ship's primary systems were shattered, but the fusion core was stable, and the fabricators and life support were salvageable. They didn't just survive, Threxia. They built." He gestured to a vast cavern to their left, where tiers of glowing hydroponics bays climbed the walls, filled with lush green vegetation. The sight made her ache. Such vitality, such life. Her own world was turning to dust and ash, the Xylari slowly starving as their crops failed in the poisoned soil. "Atmospheric processors, water purifiers, bioforges," he continued, his voice resonating with a deep, quiet pride. "We didn't conquer this world. We learned to live with it, and it with us. The symbiotic technology your people are searching for isn't in my blood. It's right here." He stopped, turning to face her. They were closer now than they had been at the campfire, the narrowness of the walkway forcing a proximity that was both unnerving and electric. She could see the fine lines around his eyes, the texture of his skin. He smelled of wood smoke, sweat, and clean earth. It was an intensely masculine living scent that stood in stark contrast to the sterile environment of her own ship. Her gaze was drawn to the strong column of his throat, the way the leather harness framed the powerful muscles of his chest. This was not a savage. He was a guardian, a leader, a product of a legacy she could barely comprehend. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why lure me here? Why not just stay hidden?" "Because our sensors picked up more than just your ship," he said, his expression turning serious. "They picked up the ecological distress signals from your home system. Famine, blight, extinction. We've faced that too. We chose to hide from the galaxy's chaos, not from a people in need. But we had to be sure. We had to know who we were dealing with. We had to see if you were a conqueror or something else." His eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw the question he wasn't asking. What was she? A soldier, blindly following orders to seize a resource? Or was she something more? The weight of his scrutiny was immense, but for the first time, it didn't feel like the gaze of a target, but of a potential equal. He was offering her a choice, one that went far beyond her mission parameters. It was a choice that could determine the fate of her entire species. And as he stood there, his calm strength a silent challenge, she realized with a jolt of alarm that her decision was becoming terrifyingly tangled with the man himself. A sudden, jarring klaxon blared through the cavern, its strident call echoing off the metal and rock. Red lights flashed along the walkways, bathing everything in a pulsating crimson glow. Nikhil's calm demeanor vanished, replaced by a focused intensity. "What is that?" Threxia demanded, her hand instinctively tightening on her rifle. "An unscheduled atmospheric entry," Nikhil said, his voice grim. He tapped a device on his wrist, and a holographic schematic shimmered into existence above it. "One vessel. Xylari military signature. It's not cloaked. They're making a statement." Her blood ran cold. Kalen. The name was a venomous whisper on her lips. Her commander. He was impatient, ruthless, and had never approved of a subtle approach. He must have grown tired of waiting for her report and decided to force the issue. "They're deploying ground troops," Nikhil said, interpreting the data flowing across his wrist display. "Landing 2 clicks from our position. They'll be on top of us in minutes. We have to move, now." He didn't wait for her agreement. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not bruising, and pulled her from the main walkway onto a smaller, darker service ladder. The solid warmth of his hand burned through the thin material of her undersuit, a startlingly intimate contact in the midst of the chaos. He moved with a speed and certainty that belied his size, leading her down through a maze of corridors she would have been instantly lost in. The sounds of his community preparing for a siege followed them, the clang of blast doors, shouted orders, the hum of defensive systems powering up. They emerged into a narrow maintenance conduit, little more than a crawl space filled with thick bundles of cables and pipes. It was dark, the only light coming from Nikhil's wrist device. "They'll sweep the main corridors first," he whispered, his voice close to her ear. His breath was warm against her skin. "We can bypass their patrols here, but we have to be silent. He killed the light, plunging them into absolute blackness. The space was incredibly tight. She was pressed against the wall, and he was pressed against her. The front of his body was a solid wall of heat against her back. Her armor plates dug into her own skin, the confines of the conduit forcing an intimacy that was breathtaking. She could feel the steady, slow rhythm of his breathing, the powerful beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. One of her pointed ears twitched, brushing against the rough texture of his beard. The sensation sent a shiver down her spine. Sounds filtered in from the main corridor beyond the thin metal wall, the heavy synchronized thud of Zilari armored boots. Kalen's soldiers, her former comrades. They were hunting her now, as surely as she had hunted Nikhil. She held her breath, every muscle in her body screaming with tension. Nikhil's hand, which had been on her arm, slid down to rest on the small of her back, a silent, steadying pressure. It was not a romantic gesture, not yet. It was a tactical communication. I am here, be still. But in the suffocating darkness, with the enemy just meters away, the touch was a blazing brand of connection, a silent alliance forged in shared danger. His strength was a shield around her, and in that moment she felt a profound and terrifying sense of safety she had never known. The patrol passed. The heavy footfalls faded down the corridor, leaving only the sound of their own breathing in the enclosed darkness. Nikhil didn't move immediately. He waited, listening, ensuring they were truly alone. Threxia's mind was a maelstrom. The solid presence of the man behind her was an anchor, but also a source of intense distraction. The hard plates of her armor were a useless barrier against the heat radiating from his body. She was hyper-aware of every point of contact. His chest against her back, his thigh alongside hers, the steadying weight of his hand. It was a purely physical reality, stripped of all context but the immediate, shared need for survival, and it was setting her nerves on fire. "They'll establish a perimeter," he finally whispered, his voice a low vibration that traveled directly through her spine. "We need to get deeper into the unrecorded sections of the lower system, places that aren't on any schematic they could have downloaded." He shifted, his hand leaving her back, and the sudden loss of contact was a palpable chill. He moved past her in the tight space, his body brushing against hers with an electric friction. "Follow me," he breathed, "and make no sound." She followed. They moved through a labyrinth of forgotten tunnels and abandoned maintenance shafts, the legacy of the first generation of survivors who had carved this place from the rock. The air grew thicker, tasting of dust and stone. It was a silent, tense journey. Here, deep in the mountain's guts, the pretense of their roles, hunter and quarry, Zilari and human, crumbled into irrelevance. They were two soldiers, cut off and hunted. He was the guide, his knowledge of this place absolute. She was the sentinel, her senses tuned to the slightest hint of pursuit. They finally stopped in a small circular chamber that looked like a defunct power junction. A single bare bulb on the ceiling cast a weak yellow light, painting their faces in shadow. "We should be safe here for a little while," Nikhil said, his voice still low. He leaned against the curved wall, running a hand through his dark hair. For the first time, she saw a hint of weariness in his expression. "Your commander is aggressive," he stated. "Kalen believes the galaxy respects only one thing, overwhelming force," she replied, her own voice sounding rough to her ears. She leaned against the opposite wall, the distance between them feeling both vast and insignificant. "He sees your community not as a people to negotiate with, but as an obstacle protecting a resource." "And what do you see?" he asked, his gaze intense. The question hit her with the force of a physical blow. What did she see? She saw a man who had met a threat with an offering of food. She saw a people who had turned a catastrophe into a thriving home. She saw a strength that was not about conquest, but about creation and endurance. And she saw, with a clarity that frightened her, that her loyalty to Kalen's brutal ideology had been eroding for a long time. This was just the final, decisive fracture. "I see a better way," she admitted, the words feeling heavy and dangerous. A slow, tired smile touched his lips. "Good, because I'm going to need your help. My people are builders, Threxia, not soldiers. We can defend our home, but we don't know how to fight a war. You do." He was asking for her trust, her allegiance. He was asking her to betray her people to save his. And as she looked at him, standing there in the dim light, his powerful form radiating a quiet determination, she realized he already had it. Kalen's tactics are predictable, Threxia said, her voice finding a new, hard-edged authority. The moment of vulnerability had passed, replaced by the cold focus of a strategist. He'll use a standard search and clear pattern, focusing on the main habitation levels. He'll underestimate you. He'll see you as colonists, not combatants. An assumption we can use, Nikhil agreed, pushing off the wall. The weariness was gone, replaced by a dangerous energy. The lower levels are a maze. The geothermal vents are unstable. There are decades of abandoned construction and mining equipment down here. A perfect kill zone, Threxia finished, her mind already mapping out choke points and ambush locations. But not to kill, to incapacitate, to capture. If we slaughter his soldiers, we give him the excuse he needs to level this entire mountain. We need to neutralize his forces and isolate him. A look of profound respect flickered in Nikhil's eyes. He had expected a soldier. He had found a commander. For the next hour they worked. It was a seamless and terrifyingly effective partnership. He provided the deep, intuitive knowledge of the environment. She provided the ruthless, tactical application. He knew which conduits could be overloaded to release disorienting blasts of steam. She knew the precise patterns to create a pincer movement. He could repurpose a dormant plasma cutter into a non-lethal energy barrier. She could predict the exact path Kalen's squads would take to bypass it. They moved through the darkness, a two-person insurgency. Threxia felt a thrill she hadn't experienced in years. This was not the rigid, by-the-book warfare of the Xylari military. This was fluid, creative, and brutally efficient. She watched as Nikhil, using little more than a cutting tool and his own raw strength, rigged a section of tunnel to collapse, not with lethal force, but to simply block pursuit. He moved with a quiet, focused ferocity that was utterly captivating. The provider, who had calmly stirred a stew by the fire, was now a protector, turning his home into a weapon to defend his people. Their first engagement was swift and silent, a 5-member Xylari squad moving cautiously down a wide service corridor. Following Threxia's whispered instructions, Nikhil triggered a pressure release from a nearby geothermal pipe. A thick, superheated cloud of steam filled the corridor, blinding the soldiers and scrambling their thermal optics. Before they could react, Threxia was among them, a ghost of motion. Using the butt of her rifle, she struck nerve clusters with surgical precision. 1, 2, 3 soldiers went down without a sound. Nikhil emerged from an alcove to handle the remaining 2, not with strikes, but with his sheer size, trapping them in a salvaged cargo net he dropped from the ceiling. It was over in seconds. They disarmed the unconscious soldiers, binding them securely. As Nikhil worked, a lock of her magenta hair fell across her face. Before she could push it away with her gauntlet, he reached out, his calloused fingers gently tucking the strand behind her pointed ear. His touch was brief, a fleeting moment of unreal softness in the midst of the violence. Her breath hitched. His eyes met hers in the dim light, and the intensity she saw there had nothing to do with the battle. It was a raw, possessive heat that mirrored the fire building deep inside her. The provider and the protector were also just a man, and the way he was looking at her made her feel, for the first time, like just a woman. The systematic neutralization of his squads drove Kalen into a fury. Threxia knew his mind. He would see it as an insult, a primitive rabble making a mockery of his elite soldiers. His pride would force him to take matters into his own hands. They made their stand in the primary geothermal exchange chamber, a vast, multi-leveled cavern filled with colossal pipes and the deafening roar of venting steam. It was a place of controlled chaos, the perfect arena for a final confrontation. "He'll come through the main access tunnel," Threxia said, her voice raised over the industrial noise. They were perched on a catwalk high above the chamber floor. "He'll bring his personal guard, but he'll lead the charge himself. He has to prove his superiority." "And we'll be waiting," Nikhil confirmed, his hand resting on a large manual valve wheel. His plan was simple and dangerous. Hers was precise and deadly. Kalen appeared exactly as she had predicted. Flanked by 2 of his best soldiers, he strode into the chamber, his silver-inlaid armor gleaming. He was the epitome of Xylari military nobility, arrogant, powerful, and rigid. "Threxia," his voice boomed, amplified by his helmet. "End this farce. Your sentimentality has cost me enough time. Hand over the human and the technology, and I may permit you an honorable death." "Your idea of honor is a disease, Kaelin," she called back, her voice clear and steady. She stepped into the light, her rifle aimed not at him, but at the ceiling supports above the tunnel entrance. Kaelin's eyes locked onto Nikhil, who stood calmly by the valve wheel. "You think this brute is your salvation? He is a relic, an animal. His kind builds with mud and scraps. We build empires." "You build cages," Nikhil countered, his deep voice cutting through the din. "And you're not welcome in our home." With a roar of pure rage, Kaelin raised his weapon. That was the signal. Threxia fired, not a lethal blast, but a high-energy bolt that superheated the rock anchors above the tunnel. Simultaneously, Nikhil threw his entire weight into the valve wheel. With a groaning shriek of tortured metal, a massive pipe below Kaelin's position vented a torrent of pressurized, non-toxic coolant, turning the floor into a treacherous sheet of ice. As Kaelin and his guards struggled for footing, the ceiling anchors gave way, and a cascade of rock and debris sealed the entrance, trapping them inside. Kaelin recovered first, his armored boots finding purchase. He charged, firing his pulse rifle wildly. Nikhil met his charge. It was a brutal, primal collision. The human, with his raw strength and leather harness, against the Xylari commander in his powered armor. Threxia provided covering fire, forcing Kaelin's guards to stay behind cover. It was Nikhil's fight. He wasn't trying to outmatch the armor, he was fighting the man inside it. He used his environment, dodging behind pipes, using the terrain to his advantage. He trapped Kaelin's arm in a valve assembly, using a discarded pipe as a lever to wrench the rifle from his grasp. Disarmed, Kaelin drew a combat blade. Nikhil met it with the knife from his belt. Steel rang on steel, a savage dance in the heart of the machine. Threxia watched, her heart hammering against her ribs, as Nikhil, battered and bruised, finally overpowered her commander, slamming him against a wall and holding the edge of his blade to the man's armored throat. The fight was over. Silence descended upon the chamber, broken only by the hiss of steam and the ragged sound of Nikhil's breathing. Kaelin's guards, seeing their commander defeated, lowered their weapons. Threxia moved quickly, her rifle steady as she disarmed them and secured their bonds. Kaelin slumped against the wall, defeated and seething, his arrogant face contorted in a mask of humiliation. He looked from Threxia's resolute expression to Nikhil's unwavering blade, and finally spat on the floor. It was the last act of a tyrant who knew he had lost. Nikhil finally stepped back, his chest rising and falling heavily. There was a deep gash on his arm and a bruise forming on his jaw. But his eyes, when they found Threxia's across the chamber, were blazing with victory and a raw, untamed emotion that made her own breath catch. The battle was done. The threat was neutralized. And in the quiet aftermath, a new kind of tension began to fill the space, one that had been simmering beneath the surface since she first saw him by the fire. It was a tension born of shared danger, mutual respect, and an attraction that was now too powerful to ignore. They left Kaelin and his men for the human security teams to collect and made their way back up through the silent corridors of the hearth. They didn't speak. There were no words for what had passed between them. The fight had stripped away the last of their pretenses, leaving only the fundamental truth of their connection. He had fought for his home, and she had chosen to fight for him. He led her not to the main habitation area, but back to the surface, emerging from a different hidden door onto a high, secluded ledge overlooking the valley. The twin suns of Viridia were just beginning to rise, painting the sky in hues of gold and violet. The air was cool and clean. He turned to her, his powerful frame a dark silhouette against the dawn. He gently reached up and touched the gash on his own jaw, then his gaze fell to her. He raised a hand, his movements slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to pull away. His calloused thumb brushed against her cheek, just below her eye, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You are a fearsome thing, Threxia of the Xylari," he murmured, his voice low and rough with emotion. "And you, Nikhil of the Hearth," she replied, her own voice unsteady, "are far more than you seem." He stepped closer, closing the small space that remained between them. His other hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in the wild mess of her magenta hair. Her pointed ears flattened slightly at the contact, a purely instinctual reaction to his proximity. He lowered his head, and she tilted hers up to meet him. Their first kiss was not soft or tentative. It was a collision, a confirmation of everything that had passed between them. The hunt, the truce, the battle, the victory. It was fierce and desperate and possessive, a claiming. His lips were firm, tasting of sweat and triumph, and the faint, earthy flavor of the stew he had made for her an eternity ago. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her armored gauntlets cold against his warm skin, and pulled him closer, surrendering completely to the overwhelming tide of sensation. The war for the future of their people would begin tomorrow. But here, in the first light of a new day, there was only this. There was only them. Epilogue: 5 years. In the grand sweeping timeline of the galaxy, it was less than a breath. For Threxia, it was the span of an entire existence, a chasm of change that separated the woman she had been from the woman she was now. She stood on the balcony of their dwelling, carved from the living rock of the high mountain face, and looked out not at an untamed wilderness, but at a valley transformed. The hearth was no longer a secret bastion of survival. It was the heart of a new world, renamed Oakhaven by Nikhil, a name that spoke of shelter and growth. Below, the city wasn't a scar upon the landscape, but an extension of it. Graceful, sweeping structures of xylari metal and composite, gleaming softly in the light of the twin suns, rose between the ancient viridian trees, connected by suspended walkways and symbiotic light bridges. Human ingenuity, with its focus on robust, adaptive systems, had been fused with xylari precision engineering. The result was a city that breathed with the planet, its power drawn from the geothermal vents that had once been their battlefield. Its food grown in vast, sun-drenched terraced farms that cascaded down the mountainside. Her armor was a relic, displayed in the city's central archive, a symbol of a past defined by desperation. Now she wore a simple, sleeveless tunic of deep indigo, tailored in a distinctly Zalari cut, but woven from the tough, soft fibers of a native plant Nikhil's people had cultivated. Her magenta hair, once a jarring splash of color in a hostile green world, now felt like a part of the vibrant landscape. It was longer, often worn in a loose braid that fell over one shoulder. Her pointed ears, no longer constantly straining for the sound of a threat, were relaxed, tuned to the familiar hum of the city and the whisper of the wind through the high peaks. She heard him before she saw him, the quiet, solid tread of his boots on the stone floor behind her. He didn't startle her. He couldn't. A part of her was always aware of him, a low, steady hum in the back of her consciousness, a sixth sense she had developed that was more reliable than any piece of tracking technology. He came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar wall of warmth and strength. He had not changed as much as she had, at least not on the surface. He was still Nikhil, his shoulders as broad, his beard still thick, though now flecked with the barest hint of silver at the temples. The lines around his eyes were deeper, etched by laughter as much as concern. He was the anchor of this new world, the chairman of the Joint Council, a title he still found vaguely ridiculous. He placed a hand on the small of her back, his thumb tracing idle circles, a simple proprietary gesture that spoke of years of shared dawns and quiet nights. "The hydroponics yield for the western sector is up 12%, he said, his voice a low rumble. It was how they often began, sharing small pieces of their day, weaving their disparate responsibilities into a single tapestry. And Ambassador Threxia has successfully negotiated a new trade route for our atmospheric purifiers with the Set T Dominion, she countered, a faint smile playing on her lips. She leaned into his touch, her head resting against his powerful shoulder. They were quite taken with the efficiency of the Xylari energy matrix combined with the durability of the human filtration medium. They were quite taken with the ambassador, he corrected gently, his lips brushing against her hair. You could sell sand to a dune dweller, my love. A soft sigh escaped her. It wasn't that simple. Their chief negotiator was Oldguard. He still sees Xylari technology as a tool of conquest, a remnant of Kalen's era. I had to spend 3 rotations convincing him that our purpose now is restoration, not rule. And you did it, Nikhil said, his tone unwavering. You showed him. That's the human way you've perfected. Let the results speak for themselves. We can talk about philosophy and ideals all day, but when a farmer on their outer moon can suddenly breathe clean air and grow a crop for the first time in a generation, the argument is over. You aren't just selling them technology, Threxia. You're delivering proof that our way works. She turned then, looping her arms around his neck. His hands slid from her back to her waist, holding her firmly. This was the truth of their lives now. Not the chaos of battle, but the steady, deliberate work of building a future. Kalen had been sent back to Xylar in disgrace, a living message to the High Command. His defeat at the hands of a relic and a traitor had shattered the foundation of the military hardliners. Faced with the undeniable proof of the Hearth's technology and the offer of a partnership instead of a conquest, the old regime had crumbled. The new Xylari government, led by pragmatists and scientists, had embraced the alliance with a desperation that quickly evolved into genuine respect. The first shipments of Oakhaven's symbiotic technology had halted the blight on their world within a single growth cycle. An entire species had been pulled back from the brink of extinction. I remember standing on a ridge not far from here, she murmured, her dark, coal-lined eyes searching his. I was watching you. I thought you were an animal. My mission was to put you in a cage. I remember that too, he said, his expression softening. You were the most dangerous and beautiful thing I had ever seen, all magenta and fury. I was terrified you'd shoot me before I could offer you supper. She laughed, a low, melodic sound that was still a surprise to her own ears. You were never terrified. You were waiting. You changed the entire nature of the hunt with a bowl of stew. It's the provider in me, he said, his smile crinkling his eyes. He leaned in, and his kiss was nothing like their first desperate collision. It was deep and knowing, a conversation without words, filled with the easy intimacy of long practice. It spoke of shared burdens and private jokes, of arguments and reconciliations, of a bond forged in fire and tempered into something unbreakable. He pulled back slightly, his gaze dropping to her lips. Speaking of which, I have something for you. He led her inside, their hands clasped. Their dwelling was not opulent, but it was a home. Human-carved wood furniture stood alongside sleek Xylari data consoles. Woven tapestries depicting the history of the hearth hung on walls of bare, ancient stone. At the center of the main room was a simple wooden table. On it sat 2 bowls, a familiar black pot simmering over a small contained heat element. The aroma that filled the room was rich and earthy, a scent that struck her with the force of a memory. It was the same stew, the local root, the wild herbs from the eastern valleys. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. He pulled out a chair for her, a gesture of old-world courtesy his people had somehow maintained through centuries of isolation. She sat, watching as he filled her bowl, then his own. He sat opposite her, just as he had at that first campfire. But there was no rifle between them now, no coiled tension, no fear. There was only the comfortable silence of 2 people who knew each other completely. She picked up her spoon, the polished wood warm in her hand, and took the first bite. The flavor was a direct conduit to the past, to the woman she had been, crouched in the ferns, her entire worldview about to be shattered. You still make this, she whispered, a lump forming in her throat. Always, he said, his voice soft. It's to remind us that the most powerful thing in the universe isn't a weapon or a ship, he said, his warm gaze holding hers across the table. It's an invitation. It's a choice to share your fire with a stranger instead of letting them freeze in the dark. Her gaze drifted past him, toward the quiet hallway that led to the other rooms. Will she have to learn that lesson, Nikhil? Our Alara? Will she have to be a hunter too? The question was heavy with the weight of her own past. He understood instantly. He reached across the table, but didn't take her hand. Instead, he just rested his open palm on the wood, an offering. No, he said with a certainty that was absolute. She won't have to be a hunter. She will be a builder, like all the children of Oakhaven. She has your focus, that intense way you look at a problem until it solves itself out of pure intimidation. A small smile touched his lips. I saw her today with her block puzzle. The square piece wouldn't fit in the round hole. She didn't cry or quit. She just sat there, staring at it for a full minute, her little ears twitching, and then she picked up the block and started grinding it against the stone floor to round the edges. She has your mind, Threxia, but she has our world, a world where she can use that fire to create, not to conquer. The image of their daughter, a tiny, determined being with his dark, unruly hair and her sharp, intelligent eyes, stubbornly reshaping the world to her will, was so vivid it brought a hot rush of tears to Threxia's eyes. She blinked them away. Alara was their legacy. Not the treaties or the trade routes or the gleaming city in the valley, but a little girl who would never know a dying world, who would see a human and a Zilari as nothing more than Mama and Papa. She finally reached across the table, and he met her halfway, their fingers intertwining over the worn wood. The grip was a silent acknowledgement of all he had said, a promise to protect the world their daughter was inheriting. The twin suns were setting, casting long shadows across the valley, but in here,